1911. What really happened in the skies over America? I never believed in coincidences. Not after that day, not after the envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday, just like any other day. I was sitting in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, sipping coffee and scrolling through old case files, when I heard the knock. Not on the door. No, that would have been too normal. This was a soft, almost hesitant tap on the window. My heart skipped a beat. I live on the 3rd floor. I hesitated, then walked over and pulled back the curtain. No one was there, but taped. To the glass was a plain manila envelope, slightly damp from the rain. I opened the window, grabbed it and stared at it for a long time. No name, no address, just my initials scribbled in black ink, DC. Inside there were photos, old, grainy and slightly faded but unmistakable. The Twin Towers, smoke, chaos. And then one that made my blood run cold. A shot of World Trade Center 7, standing tall and untouched, hours before it collapsed. I'd seen hundreds of photos from 9/11, but this one was different. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a group of men in dark suits carrying heavy black cases into the building. Who were they? And why had I never seen this photo before? Beneath the photos was a note, handwritten in the same black ink. "They lied to you. Find file 911X. I laughed. I actually laughed. It was the kind of laugh you let out when something is so absurd, so terrifying, that your brain doesn't know how else to react. File 911X? What the hell was that? I'd spent years investigating conspiracies, digging into the darker corners of history, but this felt different. It felt personal. I spent the next 2 days obsessively searching for any mention of the file. Government databases, old news archives, even the dark web. Nothing. It was like it had been erased from existence. But then I found him. Thomas Hargrove, a former low-level bureaucrat who'd worked in the Department of Defense during the early 2000s. His name popped up in an old forum thread about classified 9/11 documents. The thread had been deleted, but not before I'd copied his contact info. When I called him, his voice was shaky, like he'd been expecting me. "You shouldn't be digging into this," he said. "Why not?" I asked. There was a long pause, then barely a whisper, "Because they'll kill you." We arranged to meet the next day at a diner in Queens. I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying the photos, the note, the way Thomas's voice had cracked when he said, "They'll kill you." Who were they? And what was in that file? I never got the chance to ask. When I arrived at the diner, the place was swarming with cops. Thomas was dead. They said it was a heart attack, but I saw the way his body was slumped over the table. The way his coffee cup had been knocked over, the dark stains spreading across the floor. That wasn't a heart attack, that was a warning. And then, as I stood there staring at his lifeless body, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging or you're next." I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. His voice, his warning, the way his body had looked in that diner, lifeless but not peaceful. No, there was nothing peaceful about it. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, as if he'd seen something. In his final moments that had frozen him in terror, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that his death had nothing to do with me or the envelope. But deep down, I knew better. Someone was watching. Someone didn't want me to find the truth. The photos from the envelope were spread out on my desk, taunting me. I kept coming back to the one of World Trade Center 7, the men in suits carrying those heavy black cases. Who were they? What were they doing there? And why had no one ever talked about them? I needed answers, and there was only one place left: to look, the survivors. It took me days to track him down. Carl Mitchell. He'd been working in World Trade Center 7 on the morning of September 11th. According to the records, he'd made it out just minutes before the building collapsed. But when I finally got him on the phone, he didn't sound like a man who'd escaped death. He sounded like a man who was still running from it. I don't talk about that day. he said, his voice trembling. "I just have a few questions," I replied, trying to sound calm. "It's important." There was a long silence. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. "Meet me at the park, 10 p.m., and come alone." The park was deserted when I got there, the kind of place where shadows seemed to move on their own. Carl was sitting on a bench under a flickering street lamp, his hands clenched tightly together. He looked older than his photo, his face lined with worry, his eyes darting nervously around. "You shouldn't be here," he said as I sat down. "You shouldn't be asking these questions." "Why not?" I asked. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because they're still out there, and they don't like people poking around." I showed him the photo of the men in suits. His face went pale. "You've seen them," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his hands shaking. "They were there that morning, hours before the planes hit. They came in through the basement carrying those cases. I thought they were maintenance workers or something, but there was something off about them. The way they moved, the way they looked at you, like they weren't really human." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened to them?" I asked. Carl shook his head. "I don't know. After the first tower was hit, I tried to get out. But as I was leaving, I heard it, explosions, not from above, from below, like the building was coming apart from the inside. And then I saw them again, the men in suits. They were just standing there, watching as the building came down, like they knew it was going to happen." I tried to process what he was saying, but my mind was racing. Explosions, men in suits. It sounded like something out of a bad movie, not real life. But the fear in Carl's eyes was real, too real. "You have to stop digging," he said, grabbing my arm. "They'll come for you, just like they came for the others." "What others?" I asked. But before he could answer, a car pulled up on the street nearby. Carl froze, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered. "Oh God, they're here." He stood up and started running, disappearing into the shadows. I wanted to follow him, but something stopped me. The car's headlights were still on, shining directly at me. I couldn't see who was inside, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I left the park that night with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. I was in way over my head, and if I kept digging, I might not make it out alive. I couldn't shake the image of Carl running into the shadows, his face twisted in fear. The car that had pulled up at the park stayed in my mind too, its headlights burning into my memory like a brand. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk staring at the photos from the envelope, trying to make sense of it all. Who were those men in suits? What were they doing in World Trade Center 7? And why did Carl think they weren't human? The next morning, I got another package. This time, it was left on my doorstep. No knock, no warning, just a small unmarked box. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive. I hesitated before plugging it into my laptop. Part of me wanted to throw it out the window, to pretend I'd never seen it. But the other part, the part that had spent years chasing stories no one else would touch, knew I couldn't stop now. I plugged it in. The drive contained a single video file. It was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old security camera. The timestamp in the corner read, September 11th, 2001, 7:32 a.m. The footage showed the lobby of World Trade Center 7. People were milling about, sipping coffee, chatting, completely unaware of what was about to happen. And then I saw them, the men in suits. They moved differently from everyone else. Their steps were too precise, too synchronized, like they were following some unseen rhythm. They carried the same black cases I'd seen in the photo, their faces obscured by the low quality of the footage. But even through the grainy pixels, I could feel their presence. It was like they didn't belong there, like they were wrong. The video cut to another angle, this time showing the basement level. The men were there too, placing the black cases in specific locations, near support columns, electrical rooms, and what looked like a main gas line. My stomach churned as I realized what I was watching. This wasn't just a random recording. This was evidence. The video jumped again, this time to 5:20 p.m. The building was empty now, except for the men in suits. They stood in a circle in the lobby, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. And then it happened. A series of explosions rocked the building, starting from the basement and moving upward. The men didn't flinch. They just stood there, watching as the building began to collapse around them. The video ended with a single line of text flashing on the screen. The truth was buried with the rubble. I sat there, my hands trembling, my mind racing. This changed everything. If this video was real, and I had no reason to believe it wasn't, then the collapse of World Trade Center 7 wasn't an accident. It was planned. But by who and why? Before I could process what I'd just seen, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You weren't supposed to see that." I froze. How did they know? Were they watching me right now? I looked around. My apartment, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner. But I was alone. At least, I thought I was. That night, I had the dream again. The one I'd been having ever since I started digging into this. I was standing in the lobby of World Trade Center 7, watching as the men in suits placed the black cases. But this time they noticed me. One by one, they turned to face me, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And then they started walking. Toward me, their movements too smooth, too perfect. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as they reached me, I woke up. My apartment was silent, but I could still feel their presence, like they were there with me, watching from the shadows. I grabbed my laptop and opened the video again, hoping to find something I'd missed. But when I clicked play, the file was gone, deleted, and in its place was a single image, a black screen with white text that read, "You're getting too close." The video was gone, but its images were burned into my mind. The men in suits, the black cases, the explosions, it all played on a loop in my head, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I knew I was in over my head, but I couldn't stop. Now, not when I was this close to the truth. I spent the next few days digging through every lead I could find, no matter how small. I called old contacts, scoured obscure forums, and even reached out to a few conspiracy theorists who'd been blacklisted by the mainstream media. Most of them hung up on me or told me to drop it, but one name kept coming up, Martin Rees. He was a former engineer who'd worked on the construction of World Trade Center 7. According to the rumors, he'd gone off the grid after 9/11, but not before leaving behind a trail of cryptic messages about what really happened. It took me a week to track him down. When I finally got him on the phone, he sounded like a man who hadn't slept in years. "You shouldn't be calling me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what you know," I replied. There was a long pause. Then, "Meet me at the old subway station, midnight, and don't bring anyone." The station had been abandoned for decades, its entrance hidden behind a chain-link fence covered in graffiti. I slipped through a gap in the fence and made my way. Down the crumbling stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the only sound was the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Martin was waiting for me on the platform, his face pale and gaunt in the dim light. He looked like a ghost, his eyes darting nervously around as if expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. "You shouldn't have come," he said as I approached. "You said you'd talk to me?" I replied. He shook his head. "Talking won't change anything, but if you're determined to get yourself killed, I'll tell you what I know." He led me to a rusted bench and sat down, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "World Trade Center 7 wasn't just an office building," he began. "There were things in the basement, things they didn't want anyone to know about." "What? And kind of things?" I asked. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling around his face like a shroud. "Experiments. Technology. Stuff that didn't come from this world." I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying it was alien? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm saying it was something they couldn't control, and when they realized it was too dangerous, they decided to bury it. Literally. He told me about a project called Operation Phoenix, a secret government program that had been using the building as a cover for experiments with advanced technology. According to Martin, the men in suits were part of a shadowy organization tasked with keeping the project hidden. But something had gone wrong. The technology had become unstable, and the only way to contain it was to destroy the building. That's why they brought it down, he said. Not because of the planes, not because of the fires, because they had no other choice. I tried to process what he was saying, but it was too much. Aliens, secret experiments. It sounded like the plot of a bad sci-fi movie, but the look in Martin's eyes told me he believed every word. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you're already in too deep, he replied, and because I'm tired of running. Before I could respond, the lights went out. The platform was plunged into darkness, and I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnels. Martin grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. They're here, he whispered. You need to run. I didn't argue. I ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the platform. Behind me I heard shouts and the sound of heavy boots hitting the ground. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart pounding. In my chest, I made it to the stairs and scrambled up, my lungs burning. When I reached the surface, I didn't stop. I ran until I was blocks away, then collapsed against a wall, gasping for air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. You're running out of time. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Whoever or whatever was after me knew where I lived, and I wasn't about to make it easy for them. Instead, I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, paid in cash, and locked myself in the room. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything Martin had told me. Alien technology, a shadowy organization. It sounded insane, but the evidence was there. The photos, the video, the men in suits, it all pointed to something far bigger than I could have imagined. I spent the next few days lying low, avoiding my usual haunts and staying off the grid. But I couldn't stop digging. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. And then I got the call. It was late past midnight when my phone buzzed. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway. You're persistent, a voice said. It was calm, almost amused, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. Who is this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A friend, the voice replied. You've been asking the wrong questions, Daniel. But if you really want answers, meet me at the old factory on 5th and Main. Come alone. The line went dead before I could respond. I knew it was a trap. Of course it was. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. If I wanted the truth, I had to face it head on. The factory was a crumbling relic of the city's industrial past, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. I parked a block away and approached on foot, my heart pounding with every step. The front door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. The inside was even worse than I'd imagined. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with debris. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing rusted machinery and broken furniture. And then I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me, tall, with broad shoulders, and a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. When he turned around, I saw his face, or rather, the lack of it. His features were blurred, like a photograph that had been smudged, and his eyes were black, like two voids staring into my soul. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. I had to, I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. I need to know the truth. He tilted his head, as if considering my words. Then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. The truth is worse than you can imagine. He began to walk toward me, his movements too smooth, too precise. I backed away, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. "What are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We are the Keepers," he said. "The guardians of secrets too dangerous for your world to know." "What secrets?" He stopped just a few feet away, his black eyes boring into mine. The technology in World Trade Center 7 was not of this world. It was a gift, but also a curse. It could have changed everything, or destroyed everything. We had no choice but to bury it. I felt a wave of nausea as the pieces fell into place. The men in suits, the explosions, the cover-up, it was all real. And it was far worse than I'd ever imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you've proven yourself resourceful," he said, "but also because it doesn't matter. The truth dies with you." Before I could react, he lunged at me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a piece of debris and hitting the ground hard. My flashlight skidded across the floor, its beam flickering as it spun. I scrambled to my feet, but he was already on me, his hands closing around my throat. His grip was impossibly strong, and I felt the air being crushed from my lungs. And then, just as my vision began to blur, I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, whispering in my ear, "You're not alone." The pressure on my throat vanished, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When I looked up, the man in the suit was gone. The factory was silent, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I found the strength to stand. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out with shaking hands. A text from an unknown number. "You've seen too much. Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran out of the factory and didn't stop until I was miles away. But even now, as I write this, I know it's not over. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and they'll come for me again. I don't know how much time I have left, but I had to get this out. The world needs to know the truth, even if it costs me everything, because the truth is this: we are not alone. And some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried.